The rain fell like it was trying to punish the earth for something. I had just locked up the maintenance shed behind Mount Zion Baptist Church, my knees aching from 6 hours of fixing a busted boiler, when the sky opened up in a way I hadn't seen in years. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the old truck's windows before I even got the engine started. I'm Isaiah Brooks, 58 years old, widower, church janitor by trade, though the deacons like to call me facilities manager, like that made the paycheck any bigger. I'd been doing this work for 11 years, ever since my wife Ruth passed, and the quiet of my house got too loud to sit in alone. That night, Route 9 was empty. No headlights behind me, none ahead. Just sheets of water hammering the windshield and wipers that couldn't keep up no matter how hard they tried. I almost missed it. A flash of chrome caught my eye off to the right, half swallowed by the ditch grass. A black Mercedes flipped onto its side, one wheel still spinning uselessly in the rain. I told myself somebody else would come along. My truck barely ran on good days. I had no business stopping on a night like this, but something in my chest wouldn't let me press the gas pedal down. I pulled over. The glass had shattered across the road like scattered ice. I crawled through it on my hands and knees, feeling it bite into my palms, not caring. Inside the car, an elderly man was pinned behind the wheel, blood running down the side of his face. Beside him, a woman about his age lay slumped against the door, not moving. "Sir, can you hear me?" I shouted over the rain. His eyes fluttered open, pale blue eyes sharp even through the pain. He reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was stronger than a dying man's had any right to be. "Please," he whispered. His voice cracked, but the words came out clear. "Save my wife first." I looked at her, then back at him. "Sir, I need to get you both out. Her first." His fingers tightened. "Promise me." I don't know why I said what I said next. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like a man who'd spent his whole life giving orders and had exactly one left in him. Maybe it was just the storm or Ruth's voice somewhere in the back of my mind reminding me what kind of man I was supposed to be. "I promise," I told him. Something in his face eased just slightly, like the words had cost him the last of his strength. I worked the woman free first, cradling her head, dragging her clear of the wreckage, and laying her on the wet grass. Her pulse was faint, but there. I went back for him next, but by the time I reached him, his eyes had rolled back and his hand had gone still against the seat. Sirens split the night. A few minutes later, red and blue light bouncing off the rain. Paramedics pulled me back by the shoulders as they swarmed the car, shouting numbers to each other I didn't understand. I stood soaked to the bone on the shoulder of Route 9, watching strangers fight to keep two other strangers alive. The last thing I saw before they loaded him into the ambulance was his hand hanging limp off the stretcher fingers, slightly curled like he was still holding onto my wrist. I thought saving two strangers would be the hardest thing I'd ever do. I had no idea their son would soon accuse me of trying to steal their lives. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my recliner, still wearing my damp church clothes, staring at the muted television, replaying the old man's grip on my wrist over and over until the sun came up. By morning, I told myself my part in it was finished. I'd done what any decent person would have done. Now it was up to doctors and machines and whatever God had planned for two people I didn't even know the names of. But by noon, I was standing in the lobby of Baptist Regional, asking the woman at the front desk if she could tell me anything about the couple brought in from the Route 9 accident. She looked at me like I'd asked her something strange. "Are you family?" "No, ma'am. I'm the one who called it in." She studied me a moment, then must have decided I wasn't a threat because she softened. "The gentleman's still critical. In a coma. The lady's stable. Physically, anyway." She hesitated. "She's had some memory trouble since she woke up. Confusion. It happens sometimes with head trauma. Can I see her just for a minute?" I don't know why I asked. I told myself it was only to check that she was all right, to close the loop on the promise I'd made in the rain. The nurse walked me down the hall and pointed to a room at the end. Margaret Whitmore looked small in that hospital bed, swallowed up by white sheets and the hum of machines. Her silver hair had been combed back neatly by somebody, but her eyes, when they found me, were lost, searching, like she was trying to place a face from a dream. Then slowly she smiled. "You're the one," she said. Her voice was thin but warm. "You're the man from the road." "Yes, ma'am. Isaiah Brooks." "Isaiah." She said it like she was tasting the word, making sure it fit somewhere in the fog she was living in. "Will you come back tomorrow?" I should have said no. I should have told her I had a church to maintain a life of my own, to get back to, that our paths had only ever been meant to cross for the length of one terrible night. Instead, I heard myself say, "Yes, ma'am, I'll come back." That single word yes became another promise. And in my experience, once you've made one to a person like that breaking, it feels like breaking something in yourself. So I went back the next day, and the day after that. I brought a paperback novel from the church's little lending shelf and read to her in the afternoons, chapters about places she'd probably actually visited in her old life. Paris, the Amalfi Coast, while she lay there nodding along like she remembered every word. Some days her memory was sharp as a tack, and she'd ask me detailed questions about my late wife, about the church, about whether the boiler I'd been fixing the night of the accident ever did get properly repaired. Other days, she'd forget my name twice in the same conversation and cry quietly when she realized it. I brought her flowers from the church garden, hydrangeas, mostly since that's what Ruth used to grow, and set them in a paper cup by her window because the hospital didn't allow real vases. Margaret would touch the petals like they were the finest things she'd seen in years. "You don't have to keep coming," she told me once on maybe my fifth or sixth visit. "I know." "Then why do you?" I thought about it. "Because you asked me to, and because somebody ought to." She reached over and patted my hand the way I imagine she must have patted the hands of 100 grandchildren she probably had somewhere in some life I knew nothing about. "You're a good man, Isaiah Brooks." The nurses started to know me by name after a while. A few of them, seeing me there every afternoon like clockwork, must have assumed I was family, an uncle maybe, or an old family friend. One asked me outright one day, adjusting Margaret's IV line without looking up, "You her son?" "No, ma'am," I said. "Just someone who happened to stop." She gave me a look I couldn't quite read, somewhere between curious and suspicious, but she didn't push it further. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had no reason to. What worried me more was the conversation I overheard on my 8th visit, standing just outside Margaret's door while 2 hospital administrators spoke in hushed voices down the hall. Still no response from the son's office. "We can't keep her in a general ward indefinitely if there's no family engagement." "What about the long-term care facility on Route 40? They've got a bed opening next week." "That might be our only option if nobody claims responsibility soon." I stood there with a fresh cup of hydrangeas in my hand, feeling something tighten in my chest that had no business being there. Margaret Whitmore was not my family. She was not my responsibility. I had pulled her out of a car in a storm and kept a promise to a dying man, and by any reasonable measure, my part in her story should have already ended. But when I walked back into her room and she looked up at me with that same lost, hopeful smile asking, "Did you bring the book today?" I understood with a kind of quiet dread that I wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Not while she still needed somebody to come back tomorrow. The day the transfer papers appeared on the nurse's clipboard, Margaret fell apart. I'd walked in with my usual paper cup of flowers, expecting another ordinary afternoon, when I found her sitting bolt upright in bed, her hands twisted into the bedsheet like she was trying to anchor herself to something solid. "They want to send me away," she said before I'd even set the flowers down. "To a place with strangers. I don't know anyone there, Isaiah." "Now hold on, let's not—" "Don't leave me alone." Her voice cracked in a way that stopped me cold. "Please, I don't have anyone else." I sat down slowly in the chair beside her bed, the one that had practically become mine over the past 2 weeks. I thought about the promise I'd made to her husband in the rain. I thought about Ruth and the year I'd spent in this same hospital watching machines breathe, for her terrified every single day that somebody would decide I wasn't entitled to be in the room because I wasn't next of kin on some form. "You won't be alone," I heard myself say. "You can stay with me, just until your family sorts itself out, just until you're steady on your feet." The offer surprised me as much as it surprised her, but once it was out of my mouth, I couldn't take it back, and honestly, I didn't want to. My house wasn't much to look at. 2 bedrooms, a leaning porch, a roof that had been threatening to leak over the guest room for the better part of 3 years. Ruth's photograph still hung in the hallway, her graduation picture, the 2 of us at our wedding in front of Mount Zion, her holding a Sunday casserole dish like a trophy. I hadn't changed a thing since she passed. I didn't know how to. I gave Margaret the bedroom. I took the sofa, same as I had for 11 years whenever the quiet got too loud and I couldn't stand sleeping in the bed Ruth and I used to share. I cooked simple meals, grits and eggs, in the morning baked chicken most evenings because that's what I knew how to make. I drove Margaret to her follow-up appointments in my rattling truck, the same one that had carried me past that overturned Mercedes. Every evening after supper, I read scripture out loud. Same as Ruth and I used to do, and Margaret would close her eyes and listen like the words were medicine. Slowly, in small ways, her memory started coming back. Some days she remembered whole decades of her life in perfect detail. A house in Connecticut, a garden she'd once kept a son she spoke of with a strange, guarded tenderness. Other days she still forgot my name by dinner time, but she never once forgot to thank me before bed. "I don't know what I did to deserve you showing up that night," she told me once. "You didn't do anything," I said. "That's kind of the point." I thought that was the whole of it. A man keeping a promise, a woman healing in a stranger's guest room. I didn't think much past the next appointment, the next meal, the next evening of reading. I should have known better. Small towns talk. And there was nothing small town folks like talking about more than something that didn't fit the story they already had in their heads. It started slow. A neighbor 2 doors down, Mrs. Pruitt, asking me over the fence in a voice dripping with false concern whether that woman was doing all right, whether her family knew where she was. I told her yes, of course they did, though the honest truth was I still hadn't managed to reach anyone. Then it was the checkout girl at the grocery store giving me a long look when I bought 2 dinners worth of food instead of my usual one. Then it was worse. I came home from the church one afternoon to find a car I didn't recognize parked slowly down the block engine, idling a man inside with a camera pointed at my front porch. By the time I crossed the yard to ask what he was doing, he'd already pulled away. 2 days later, my nephew Marcus called me, his voice tight, with something between worry and warning. "Uncle Isaiah, you seen Facebook? You know I don't mess with that stuff. There's a post going around, picture of you and some old white lady on your porch. People saying all kinds of things, saying you're—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Saying you're taking advantage of her, that you're after her money." I stood there in my kitchen holding the phone, feeling something cold settle low in my stomach. "I pulled her out of a car wreck, Marcus. I made a promise to her husband. I know that. I believe you. But you know how people talk when they see what they want to see instead of what's really there." I did know. I'd lived 60 years as a black man in this town, and I understood exactly the shape of the story people were already writing about me before they'd bothered to ask a single question. Margaret, for her part, had no idea any of it was happening. She spent her days content in my little house tending the small patch of hydrangeas I'd planted along the fence in Ruth's memory, humming old songs she half remembered the words to. I didn't have the heart to tell her that our quiet arrangement had become the subject of whispered gossip across half the county. I tried to reach her family again, called every number the hospital had on file, left messages that went unanswered for days. It was like the son, whoever he was, had simply vanished from the face of the earth the moment his parents needed him most. Then one evening, coming home from a late shift at the church, I turned onto my street and saw it. A police cruiser parked directly across from my driveway engine, off a single officer sitting inside watching my front door like he was waiting for something or someone. I sat in my truck for a long moment before I found the nerve to pull in. Whatever this was, I understood without anyone having to tell me that the trouble I'd been half expecting since that night on Route 9 had finally arrived at my front door. The officer who stepped out of the cruiser was young, maybe 30, with the careful, practiced politeness of someone who'd been trained not to jump to conclusions, but hadn't quite learned how to hide the ones he'd already jumped to. "Mr. Brooks," he asked, tipping his hat. "Officer Dale Whitfield. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" "About what exactly?" "We received a welfare concern regarding a Margaret Whitmore. Reports that she's been staying here with you." I kept my voice even the way I'd learned to keep it even my whole life whenever a badge showed up, asking questions it had no real right to ask. "She's staying in my guest room. I pulled her and her husband out of a car accident on Route 9 2 weeks back. I've been trying to reach her family ever since." "Uh-huh." He wrote something down on a small notepad, though I couldn't imagine what there was to write. "And you two aren't related in any way?" "No, sir. But she's living with you, temporarily, until her family can be located." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've already decided something and are just waiting for you to finish talking so they can move on to what they actually came to say. "Would you mind if I spoke with Mrs. Whitmore directly, just to confirm she's comfortable that everything here is voluntary?" "She's in the kitchen. Come on in." Margaret, bless her, handled it better than I did. She sat at my table with a cup of tea, patted the officer's hand when he introduced himself, and told him plainly that Isaiah Brooks was the finest man she'd met since her own husband, that she was there because she wanted to be, and that if he had any further questions, he could direct them to her at his leisure because she had nowhere else pressing to be. The officer left apologizing, though I noticed the apology was thinner than the suspicion had been. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, I got a call from the hospital's billing office informing me that a temporary financial power of attorney, I'd filed simple paperwork to authorize Margaret's outpatient prescriptions. Nothing more had been frozen pending review by the hospital's legal counsel. Nobody could tell me who had requested the review. Nobody would say why. Then the bank called. The small joint account I'd helped Margaret open just to cover groceries and gas for her appointments had been flagged for unusual activity and temporarily restricted. I sat at my kitchen table that night with a stack of paperwork I didn't fully understand, feeling for the first time in my life like the ground under a good deed could shift into something resembling a crime scene just because of who was standing on it. Church didn't offer much relief either. Sunday service, usually the one place I felt steady, had become its own kind of minefield. Deacon Willis pulled me aside after the sermon, his voice low and careful in the way men use when they're about to say something they know will hurt. Isaiah, folks are asking questions about the situation with Mrs. Whitmore. I know what they're asking, Deacon. I'm not saying I believe any of it, but you understand how it looks. A man in your position, a woman in hers, a man in my position, I repeated slowly, made a promise to a dying man in the rain. That's the whole of it. Deacon Willis didn't have a response for that. Nobody ever really did when I said it plain like that. But saying it plain didn't stop. The whispers didn't stop Mrs. Pruitt's fence line concern, didn't stop the strangers who'd started slowing their cars in front of my house like it was some kind of tourist attraction. Margaret felt it too in her own way, even if she couldn't always name it. She started apologizing constantly for the trouble, for the attention, for existing, it seemed like some days. "I'm sorry," she said one evening, watching me sort through yet another stack of frozen paperwork. "I've turned your whole life upside down. You didn't ask me to save you," I told her, same as I'd told her a dozen times before. "I chose to. That's not something you get to apologize for." She reached over and squeezed my hand the way she did most evenings now, and I tried to believe my own words as fully as I wanted her to believe them. But underneath it, the truth was heavier than I let on. Every day that passed without word from Charles Whitmore's family, without so much as a returned phone call, the promise I'd made in that ditch on Route 9 grew a little heavier on my shoulders. Charles himself remained unconscious in the ICU, a man I'd only ever seen with his eyes half open and blood on his face, a man whose entire life I knew nothing about except the 11 words he'd managed to say to me before he went under. "Please, save my wife first. Promise me." I had promised. I intended to keep it, but keeping it was starting to cost more than I think either of us had understood that night in the storm. 3 weeks after the accident, I came home from an evening shift to find a car in my driveway that made every other car that had slowed in front of my house look like nothing at all. A black SUV polished to a shine that didn't belong on any road in this county, tires still ticking from the drive, Vermont plates. A driver standing beside it in a dark suit, arms folded, watching my front door with the patient, unbothered look of a man who was used to waiting exactly as long as he wanted to, and not 1 minute more. I parked my truck slowly, my chest tightening with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Relief maybe that someone from Margaret's family had finally come. And underneath that relief, something colder. A sense that whatever walked out of that vehicle wasn't going to see me the way Margaret did. I was right. He didn't get out of the SUV right away. I stood on my porch for a full minute watching that tinted back window before the door finally opened, and a man stepped out who looked like he'd been built in a completely different world than mine. Mid-30s, a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my truck, a watch on his wrist that caught the porch light and threw it back sharp as a blade. He walked up my cracked front path like he was crossing a boardroom every step, measured, his eyes moving over my house, the leaning gutter, the peeling paint, the hydrangeas along the fence, cataloging it all, filing it away. "Isaiah Brooks." His voice was flat. Not a question, really. A confirmation. "That's right. Daniel Whitmore." He didn't offer his hand. "I understand my mother has been staying here." "Your mother and I've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks, Mr. Whitmore." Nobody answered. Something flickered across his face, irritation maybe at being made to explain himself on a stranger's porch. I've been dealing with my father's medical trustees and half a dozen attorneys. I came the moment I could confirm this situation was real. He said situation like it was a diagnosis. Who exactly are you? There was no gratitude in the question, no relief that his mother was alive, cared for cooking supper in a kitchen not 30 feet away, instead of lying alone in some transfer facility with strangers. Just suspicion, cold and immediate, yet the kind that arrives already fully formed before a single fact has been laid out. I pulled your parents out of their car on Route 9, I said. Your father asked me to save your mother first. I promised him I would. I've been keeping that promise ever since. That's the story. That's what happened. Daniel studied me a long moment, and I understood watching him that he had already decided who I was before he'd ever driven up. A poor black man from a small southern town living alone, suddenly hosting a wealthy elderly white woman in his home, to a man like Daniel Whitmore, there was only ever going to be one story that made sense of that picture, and it wasn't the true one. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded check, holding it out to me between two fingers like he was handing a tip to a valet. $500,000, he said, for your trouble. I assume that settles whatever arrangement my mother believes she owes you. I didn't take it. I didn't even look at it. Your father's still breathing because I stopped, I said. Your mother smiles because I stayed. Keep your money, Mr. Whitmore. He blinked, and for just a moment something like uncertainty crossed his face, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him. It didn't last long. It hardened back into suspicion almost immediately, and I understood that in his world, a man who turned down $500,000 wasn't a man of principle. He was a man playing a longer, smarter con. I'll be honest with you, he said, tucking the check away. I don't know what you're after, but I intend to find out. I'm not after anything. Everyone's after something, Mr. Brooks. He said it like a fact he'd learned the hard way in boardrooms and courtrooms and family dinners I'd never be part of. I've built a career finding out what people are hiding. I'll find out what you're hiding too. Margaret appeared in the doorway, then drawn by the sound of voices, her face lighting up the way it always did lately whenever there was company. Daniel, she said, and for a moment I saw something almost soften in him, a flicker of the sun underneath the suit. You came. Of course I came, Mother. He crossed the porch and embraced her carefully, like she might break. I've been so worried. Isaiah's been taking wonderful care of me. Has he? Daniel's eyes found mine over her shoulder, and whatever softness had briefly appeared vanished behind them again. We'll talk about that. He stayed 20 minutes, long enough to confirm his mother was, in his words, stable, long enough to tell her that arrangements were being made for her to move into a proper facility near the hospital, close to his father, close to people who could actually take care of her. Margaret's face fell at the suggestion, but Daniel didn't seem to notice or didn't let himself. Before he left, he turned back to me one last time. I'll have someone in touch, Mr. Brooks. Don't leave town. I watched the SUV pull away, taillights disappearing down my quiet street, and felt the full weight of what I'd stepped into settle over me, like the storm clouds that had rolled in the night of the accident. I had made a promise to a dying man. I had kept it faithfully at real cost to my peace, my reputation, my standing in a town that had known me my whole life, and was now looking at me like a stranger. And the reward for that faithfulness, it seemed, was a rich man's son deciding I was a thief. That night, after Daniel's SUV had long since disappeared down the road, Margaret found me on the porch, sitting in the dark, the hydrangeas nothing but shadows along the fence line. He means well, she said quietly, easing herself into the chair beside mine. He's just frightened. He always turns cold when he's frightened, ever since he was a boy. He wants me gone, Margaret. I know. She reached over and took my hand the same way she had every evening for weeks now. But I'm not going anywhere, not without you. I didn't have the heart to tell her that the decision might not be entirely hers to make. Somewhere in a hospital bed 20 miles away, her husband remained unconscious, the only man alive who could confirm my story with any real authority. And somewhere in Daniel Whitmore's mind, investigators were probably already being hired, files already being opened, a case already being built against a man whose only crime had been stopping his truck in the rain. The call came on a Thursday morning just past 7 while I was elbow deep in dish soap at my kitchen sink. Mr. Brooks. The voice on the other end was clipped professional. This is Dr. Alvarez from Baptist Regional ICU. Mr. Whitmore is awake. I set the dish towel down slowly. Charles is awake. He's been asking for someone, insisting on it actually since about 4 this morning. He won't calm down until he sees a man he keeps calling the one who stopped. We weren't sure who that was until one of the nurses remembered you'd been visiting Mrs. Whitmore. I was in my truck within 10 minutes, Margaret in the passenger seat, clutching her purse like it might steady her, both of us silent for the entire drive, afraid to hope out loud in case hoping jinxed it. The ICU was a different kind of quiet than the rest of the hospital, hushed, careful machines breathing where people couldn't. Daniel was already there when we arrived, pacing the hallway outside his father's room, his phone pressed to his ear until he saw us, then lowering it slowly. "He's been asking for you," Daniel said to me, and there was something new in his voice. Not warmth exactly, but the suspicion had cracked open just enough to let confusion through. "Can I see him?" "He won't stop asking." Charles Whitmore looked smaller than I remembered from that night in the rain, swallowed up by hospital sheets and tubes, his silver hair thin against the pillow. But his eyes when they found me in the doorway were exactly as sharp as they'd been that night, exactly as fierce as they'd been when he grabbed my wrist and refused to let go. "There he is," Charles said, his voice raspy but unmistakably clear. "There's the man." "Mr. Whitmore. Good to see you awake, sir." "Isaiah." He said my name like he'd been holding on to it for weeks, saving it for exactly this moment. "You kept your promise." "Yes, sir, I did." Margaret moved past me to her husband's side, taking his hand, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, just looked at each other with the kind of relief that doesn't need words. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching, his arms crossed, still trying to make sense of a scene that didn't fit the story he'd already written. "Dad," he finally said, "you need to rest. We can talk about all this later." "No." Charles's voice weak as it was carried enough authority to stop his son cold. "We're talking about it now. Daniel, come here." Daniel approached the bed slowly. "This man," Charles said, nodding toward me, "crawled through broken glass in the middle of a storm to pull your mother out of that car. Do you understand that glass? In the rain. A stranger with nothing to gain while I was pinned behind that wheel begging him to save her first." "Dad, I know the basic story, but you don't know anything." Charles's grip tightened on Margaret's hand. He carried her to the grass. He kept her breathing until the ambulance came. And then when nobody from this family answered a single phone call for 3 weeks, Daniel, he took her into his own home, gave her his own bed, slept on a sofa in a house that's probably smaller than your office, and he did it without asking for one dime. The room had gone very quiet. Even the machines seemed to hush themselves. "I offered him money," Daniel said, and for the first time I heard something almost like shame creeping into his voice. "He wouldn't take it." "Of course he wouldn't." Charles's eyes found mine again, softer now than they'd been in the rain, but no less intense. "Isaiah, tell him. Tell him what you told me out there on the road." "What did you say to me?" I hesitated, but the old man was watching me with an expression that demanded honesty, so I gave it to him. "I promised I'd save her first," I said, "and I have every day since. Not because anybody asked me to, and not for money, because a promise made to a dying man in the rain is still a promise, sir, whether or not the man survives to collect on it." Charles nodded slowly like I'd confirmed something he'd already known in his bones. Then he turned back to his son, and his voice when it came was heavier than anything else he'd said. "You inherited my company, Daniel. The stock, the board seats, the corner office. All of it someday when I'm gone. But you never inherited my ability to recognize a good man when one crawls through glass to save your mother's life." He paused, letting the words settle. "That's a failure of mine, not yours. I was too busy building an empire to teach you what actually matters. I'm ashamed of that. But it doesn't change what's true right now in this room." Daniel said nothing. His jaw worked. His eyes moved from his father to his mother to me, and I watched something collapse behind his composed, expensive exterior. Some carefully built structure he'd been standing on for a long time, cracking under the weight of a truth he hadn't wanted to hear. "I had investigators looking into him," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself. "Financial records, background checks. I thought." "I know what you thought." Charles's voice softened, tired, now the effort of the conversation clearly costing him. "You thought the way this world taught you to think, that everyone has a price, and if a man won't take the money, it's because he's holding out for something bigger. And if I was wrong, then you owe this man an apology far bigger than a check. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Margaret wept quietly, still holding her husband's hand, and I stood there in that hospital room, feeling the strange, hollow relief of finally being seen, not as a suspect, not as a threat, but simply as a man who had done what he said he would do. Daniel looked at me one last time, and whatever he was searching for on my face, I don't know if he found it. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving the three of us, Charles, Margaret, and me, sitting together in a silence that finally, for the first time in 3 weeks, felt like peace instead of suspicion. "He'll come around," Charles said quietly, watching the empty doorway his son had disappeared through. "He's not a bad man, Isaiah. Just a man who forgot what good looks like because nobody ever showed him." I thought about that for a long time on the drive home that evening, Margaret asleep against the window beside me, exhausted from the emotion of the day. I thought about Daniel's face in that hospital room, not the cold, suspicious mask he'd worn on my porch, but the cracked, uncertain thing underneath it, a grown man realizing, maybe for the first time in years, that he'd built his whole understanding of people on the wrong foundation. I didn't know yet whether that realization would change anything. I didn't know if a man like Daniel Whitmore, raised in boardrooms and taught to weigh every kindness for its hidden cost, could truly unlearn a lifetime of suspicion in the space of one hospital room confession. But I knew at least that the truth had finally been spoken out loud in front of witnesses by the one man whose word Daniel couldn't dismiss. And sometimes I was learning that's the only opening a promise needs. I didn't hear from Daniel Whitmore for 4 days after that hospital room, long enough that I'd started to believe Charles's confidence in his son had been more hope than prophecy. Then on a Tuesday evening, I heard a car pull into my driveway, not the polished black SUV with its silent waiting driver, but a plain sedan, the kind you'd rent at any airport in the country. I looked out my window and saw Daniel Whitmore climbing out alone. No suit this time, just a plain gray shirt sleeves pushed up, no watch catching the light. No lawyers trailing behind him, no assistant holding a folder of talking points. Just a man standing in my front yard looking for the first time since I'd met him, uncertain of what to do with his own hands. I opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Brooks," he cleared his throat. "Do you have a few minutes?" I stepped aside and let him in. Margaret had gone back to the hospital that afternoon to sit with Charles, so it was just the two of us in my small living room, Ruth's photographs watching from the hallway wall. He didn't sit right away. He stood near the window looking out at the hydrangeas along the fence, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the cold authority I'd first heard on my porch. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one, not the kind I tried to hand you folded up in a check." "I'm listening." He turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression I hadn't expected. Not embarrassment exactly, but something closer to grief. "I believed everyone had a price," he said. "That's how I was raised, more or less. My father built an empire out of knowing exactly what people wanted and giving it to them at the right moment. I learned to do business the same way. Find the leverage, find the price. It works. It's worked for me my whole career. And it worked on everybody you met until it didn't work on me." "Until it didn't work on you," he agreed quietly. I gestured toward the sofa, and this time he sat elbows on his knees staring at the floor like a man carrying something heavy he'd finally decided to set down. "That's because you've spent your whole life surrounded by people who did have a price," I told him. "That's not your fault, not entirely, but it's not mine to fix either. I only know what I know, which is that a promise made to a dying man in a storm doesn't come with a dollar amount attached." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had thinned out, stripped of its usual polish. "I haven't had dinner with my parents in 3 years, he said. "Not really. Holidays, sure. 20 minutes between meetings, a call from the car on the way to the airport. I told myself I was building something for them, for the family, the company, the legacy. I told myself that mattered more than being there." He shook his head slowly. "And then a stranger sleeps on his own sofa for 3 weeks to make sure my mother isn't alone. And I show up with a checkbook like that's supposed to settle the debt. Money's the only language a lot of people ever teach their children," I said. "Doesn't make you a bad man, Daniel. Makes you a man who learned the wrong lesson from good intentions." He looked up at me, something raw in his eyes now. "I confused success with love my whole life. I thought if I built something big enough, impressive enough, it would somehow prove I cared. I never once thought about just showing up, sitting with them, reading to my mother. He laughed short and humorless. You did more for my parents in 3 weeks than I did in 3 years, and you didn't even know their last name when you started. I knew Charles Whitmore needed me to save his wife. That's all I needed to know at the time. Daniel nodded slowly, and for a while, neither of us said anything at all. I got up and made 2 cups of coffee, plain the way I always made it, and set one down in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the mug like it was the first warm thing he'd held in a long time. We sat there in silence for a good 10 minutes, 2 men who'd started out as suspect and accuser, now just sharing a quiet evening in a small living room that had somehow become the site of more honesty than any boardroom Daniel had ever sat in. I don't know how to fix what I did, he finally said. The investigators, the accusations. My mother told me what people in town were saying about you because of me poking around asking questions. You don't fix it with money, I said. You already tried that. Then how? I thought about it at a long moment, turning my coffee cup slowly in my hands. You keep showing up, I told him. Same as I did. That's the only currency that's ever meant anything far as I've seen. Daniel looked at me like that answer was both simpler and harder than anything he'd expected, and I understood watching him sit there in my modest living room with his sleeves rolled up and his composure finally fully cracked open, that something real had shifted in him. Not fixed, not yet, but shifted. The beginning of a man learning late but not too late what his father had spent a lifetime forgetting to teach him. Before he left that evening, he paused at the door and turned back to me. Thank you, he said, for my mother, for my father, for not being the man I assumed you were. Thank you for coming back to say it. He nodded once, got in his rented sedan, and drove off into the evening, leaving me standing on my porch in the fading light, thinking about promises, the ones we make out loud to dying men in the rain, and the quieter ones we make to ourselves about who we still intend to become. Charles Whitmore was discharged from Baptist Regional 3 weeks later, thinner than I remembered him, leaning heavily on a cane, but alert and sharp-eyed, in a way that made it hard to believe he'd ever been the pale, bleeding man I'd pulled from a wrecked Mercedes. He asked to see me the day he got settled back home, a sprawling house on the edge of town I'd never had reason to visit before, the kind of place with a circular driveway and a fountain that actually worked. Margaret met me at the door, hugging me the way she'd taken to doing every time we saw each other. Now, like the hug itself, was a small act of defiance against everything the town had whispered about us. Charles was in a sunroom at the back of the house, seated in a wide leather chair with a blanket over his knees, despite the warm afternoon. He looked up when I came in and gestured toward the chair across from him. Sit, Isaiah. I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Yes, sir. He studied me for a long moment, the same sharp appraisal I remembered from the night of the accident, before he finally spoke. Tell me honestly, what do you want out of all this? I know you didn't ask for any of it, and I know you turned my son's check away without so much as glancing at it. So I'm asking directly, what do you want? I sat with the question a while before I answered it, because it deserved more than a quick reply. I want to walk through my own town without people assuming the worst about me, I finally said. I've lived here my whole life, Mr. Whitmore. Buried my wife 3 streets from where we're sitting. Fixed the boiler at Mount Zion for 11 years without a single complaint. And it took 3 weeks of doing the right thing by your family for half this county to start looking at me like I'm some kind of con man. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. I want to belong somewhere before I die. That's it. That's the whole of it. Charles didn't say anything right away. He just nodded slowly, his eyes glistening slightly, and reached over to pat my hand the same way Margaret always did. That's a smaller wish than most men would have made given the chance, he said quietly. It's not small to me. No, he agreed. I don't imagine it is. He didn't say much else that afternoon. He asked about Ruth, about the church, about how a man learns to cook grits properly, and I found myself talking more freely than I had in years, the conversation drifting easy and unhurried. 2 men who'd started as strangers on a rainy road, now simply sitting together in the quiet of a Sunday. Weeks passed. Life, for the first time since the accident, began to settle into something resembling normal. Margaret moved back into the Whitmore house to be near Charles during his recovery, though she called me nearly every day, and the 2 of them insisted I come to Sunday dinner, an invitation I mostly accepted. The police cruiser stopped parking outside my house. Mrs. Pruitt stopped asking pointed questions over the fence. The photographs on social media faded into the noise of whatever new gossip had replaced them. I believed honestly that the story was over, that I'd kept my promise, that the truth had finally come out, and that the rest of my life would simply return to what it had been before the storm. Then one afternoon in late autumn, my phone rang. It was Daniel. "I want to do something," he said without much preamble. "Publicly, about what happened, about what people said about you." "Daniel, you don't have to." "I do, actually." His voice was steady, certain in a way I hadn't heard from him before. "I called a press conference, not for the company, not for publicity. God knows the company doesn't need it. I want the town to hear the whole story from me on the record. What you did, what I assumed, what I was wrong about." I sat with that for a moment, turning it over. "Your father know about this?" "He suggested it," Daniel said, and I could hear something almost like pride in his voice. "Said it was time somebody with a microphone corrected a story that never should have been told wrong in the first place." 2 weeks later, I stood in the back of a small conference room at the town hall, watching Daniel Whitmore stand behind a podium in front of local reporters, and half the town, including Mrs. Pruitt, who had the decency to look uncomfortable in the front row. Daniel spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He told them about the accident, about the promise his father made me keep, about the 3 weeks I'd spent caring for his mother, while his own family failed to answer a single phone call. He told them about the investigators he'd hired, the accusations he'd let fester, the check I'd refused. He didn't spare himself a single uncomfortable detail. "I judged a man by the color of his skin and the size of his bank account." Daniel said, his voice carrying clear across the silent room, "when I should have judged him by the content of his character, same as anyone deserves to be judged. Isaiah Brooks is the reason both my parents are alive today. He asked for nothing in return. The town owes him better than what it gave him these past 2 months, and so do I." I stood in the back of that room, feeling every eye eventually find its way to me, and for the first time since that night in the storm, the attention didn't feel like suspicion. It felt finally like being seen. Life after the press conference did go back to something like normal. People nodded to me on the street again, the way they always had before the accident, before the whispers, before a black SUV pulled into my driveway and turned my quiet life upside down. Mrs. Pruitt even brought over a casserole one Sunday, mumbling something about how she'd always known there was more to the story, which I accepted graciously, because forgiveness costs less than holding on to every slight a person's ever handed you. 3 weeks after the press conference, I was out back trimming the hydrangeas along my fence when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I straightened up, half expecting Margaret or maybe Charles, still moving slow these days, but stubbornly insisting on getting out of the house whenever he could. It was Daniel. Alone again, same as his second visit, dressed simply, nothing in his hands that I could see, except a small canvas bag slung over one shoulder. "Mr. Brooks," he said, and there was an ease in his voice now that hadn't been there even during his apology. "I've got something for you. From my father." "Another check?" I asked, half joking. He smiled, the first real smile I'd ever seen on him. "No, not this time." He reached into the bag and pulled out an old brass key worn smooth with age, attached to a faded leather tag. I turned it over in my hand, confused. "What's this open?" "The old community center on Larkin Street. The one that's been boarded up since I was a kid." He watched my face carefully. "My father bought that building nearly 20 years ago. Nobody in the family ever knew why. He never developed it, never sold it, never explained it to anyone who asked. Just paid the taxes on it every year and let it sit. Why give it to me?" Daniel reached back into the bag and pulled out a folded envelope, handing it over along with the key. "He wrote you a letter, asked me to bring it myself rather than mail it. Said some things need to be delivered by hand." I opened the envelope right there on my porch. Daniel standing quietly beside me while I read Charles Whitmore's careful, slightly shaky handwriting. "Isaiah, you spent your life opening doors for strangers, a church boiler room, a hospital room, the door of your own home to a woman you'd never met before that night in the rain. You never once asked what was in it for you. That's rarer than any fortune I've ever built, and I've built a few. It's time someone opened a door for you. The Larkin Street building has sat empty for 20 years because I never found the right person to trust with it. I understand now I was simply waiting without knowing it for you. Do with it whatever your heart tells you to do. I only ask that whatever it becomes, it carries a little of what you carried into that hospital room every day for 3 weeks. Patience without asking for anything back. With gratitude, I can never fully repay Charles. I stood on my porch for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in my hands, unable to find words for what I was feeling. "He means it," Daniel said quietly. "The building's already been transferred into your name. No strings, no conditions. It's yours to do with as you see fit." It took me the better part of 2 months to figure out what that meant. I walked through that old community center more times than I could count. Sunlight cutting through broken windows, dust thick over the old hardwood floors, and slowly, piece by piece, an idea took shape. Not a monument to what had happened to me, but a place built out of exactly what Charles had described. A door finally opened wide. We called it the Brooks Community House. Margaret helped me choose the paint colors for the main hall soft yellows. She insisted because yellow makes old bones feel young again. Daniel funded the renovation quietly without a single press release, without his name on a plaque anywhere, which I noticed and never mentioned, because I understood by then that some men needed to prove their growth in silence before they trusted themselves to prove it out loud. Seniors began gathering there every morning for coffee and conversation, filling the same kind of quiet that used to sit heavy in my own house before Margaret arrived. Local kids came after school for tutoring, sprawled across long tables with mismatched chairs I'd collected from half the yard sales in the county. Veterans found their way in on Thursday evenings, trading stories over card games that ran late into the night. Struggling families picked up hot meals on Friday afternoons. No questions asked, no forms to fill out, because I remembered too well what it felt like to have your dignity questioned in exchange for help you desperately needed. Mount Zion's deacons, the same men who'd once pulled me aside with uncomfortable questions, became some of my most faithful volunteers. Mrs. Pruitt, of all people, started running the children's reading hour every Tuesday, and I let that be enough because grudges are heavy things to carry into a place built on second chances. I still visit Ruth's grave every Sunday after church, same as I always have. I tell her about the community house now, about the laughter that fills rooms that used to sit boarded up and forgotten, and I like to believe she'd have approved of what that old brass key eventually became. The night I stopped for that overturned Mercedes on Route 9, soaked through and afraid, I believed I was saving two strangers from a storm neither of us had chosen. Looking back now, standing most mornings in the doorway of a place filled with warmth and voices and second chances, I understand something I couldn't have seen that night. They were the ones who rescued me. The older I get, the more I believe that kindness is rarely rewarded the way we expect. Sometimes it doesn't bring money. Sometimes it doesn't erase the pain of the years before it. Sometimes it simply gives someone the courage to believe in people again. If Isaiah's story reminded you of someone who quietly changed another person's life without asking for anything in return, I hope you'll honor them today. Leave a comment and tell us, have you ever met someone whose kindness restored your faith in humanity? Your story might become the encouragement another person desperately needs. And if this journey touched your heart, please share it with someone you love, a parent, a lifelong friend, a neighbor, or anyone who still believes that compassion matters. Because in a world that often celebrates wealth and power, the people we remember most are usually the ones who chose kindness when no one was watching.